A Flash in the Dark, Chapter 7, Home. We have quite a bit to discuss. Dr. Wells smiled and Barry stammered, "Oh my gosh, you're Dr. Harrison Wells, but how? What am I doing here?" she babbled, finally pulling on the sweater Cisco had handed her. Dr. Wells smiled and motioned Barry to follow him. Barry blushed slightly and followed. "Sorry, I must sound like a complete moron. I just can't believe I'm actually here. I've always wanted to meet you face to face," she said with an embarrassed laugh. Dr. Wells laughed lightly. "Well, you certainly went through quite a bit of trouble to do it. Star Labs hasn't been operational since FEMA categorized us a Class 4 hazardous location. 17 people died that night. Many more were injured, the two of us included." Dr. Wells led her to a slightly scorched observation deck. She looked over the edge and swore. Below them was what Barry recognized from her science magazines as the particle accelerator's core, or at least what was left of it. It was nothing more than a blackened mass of metal now. "What happened?" Barry asked, unable to tear her eyes away from the mangled ruin of the device. Dr. Wells leaned forward in his wheelchair, lacing his fingers together. 9 months ago, the accelerator went online exactly as planned. For 45 minutes, I had achieved my life's dream. Then there was an anomaly. The electron volts became unmeasurable, the ring under us popped. Energy from that detonation was thrown into the sky, and that in turn seeded a storm cloud, he explained, turning his attention to Barry. She nodded. "That created a lightning bolt that struck me," she finished, looking up. The roof had been patched in the central areas of the lab, but here it was still relatively open. Dr. Wells nodded up at Barry. "That's right. I was recovering myself when I heard about you. Your circumstances were interesting." Dr. Wells explained the circumstances of how she'd come to be at Star Labs as they made their way back to the Cortex. "So they allowed us to bring you back here, where we were able to stabilize you," he finished as Cisco glanced up from his computer, grinning at them. Barry smiled slightly. "Joe and Iris?" she asked. Dr. Wells smiled lightly. "Yes, they visited you often," Dr. Wells said, nodding. Barry smiled. Caitlin handed Dr. Wells a cup of coffee and looked up at Barry. "Iris talks a lot," Caitlin deadpanned. Cisco grinned. "Plus she's hot," Cisco said before shaking his head slightly. Barry frowned. "I need to go," she made for the door as Caitlin reached out to try and stop her. "You can't," Caitlin insisted. Dr. Wells nodded. "Caitlin's right. You're still going through changes," Wells said, pushing his wheelchair forward. Barry shook her head. Cisco cleared his throat and held up her purse. For whatever reason, Iris had decided that it would be a good idea to leave it there on one of her many visits. Barry took it with a smile. "I feel fine. Thank you for saving my life." Barry dodged around the corner and then peeked back around it. "Can I keep the sweatshirt?" she asked with a sheepish grin. Dr. Wells's mouth twitched into a small smile. "Yeah, keep the sweatshirt," Wells said, rolling his eyes. Barry grinned and waved before she left. Caitlin shook her head. "Really?" she asked, gesturing towards the door. Dr. Wells smiled lightly. "Don't worry, Caitlin. I'm sure she'll be back." Dr. Wells wheeled away down the hall. Iris was having an ordinary day. She'd fallen into something of a routine ever since Barry had been struck with the lightning bolt. She went to work, school, and would visit Barry any time she got the chance. She and Eddie would go out about once a week, and she was all right with the routine. She just wished her sister would show any signs of waking. She poured a refill and glanced up at the door. Her breath caught in her throat at the sight that met her. Barry, dressed in a pair of gray sweatpants and a deep blue sweater. She grinned at her sister as she entered the small coffee shop. Iris set down the coffee pot on the table and nearly ran Barry over with the force of her hug. "Oh my God, Barry, you're awake! Why didn't Star Labs call?" Iris demanded, pulling back to look her over. Barry grinned and pulled Iris back in. "I just woke up." The sound of Barry's voice after so long was like music to her ears. Iris wiped away tears. "Are you okay to be on your feet?" she asked, pulling Barry towards the table. Barry smiled at her sister. Iris, I'm okay, she assured. Iris's eyes filled with tears as they spilled down her face again, and she hugged Barry closer. I watched you die, Barry. Your heart kept stopping. You kept dying. Iris choked out. Barry grabbed Iris's hand and put it over her heart. See? Still beating, Barry said, and Iris smiled. Feels really fast. Barry nearly panicked when the whole world slowed to a crawl around her. The girl behind Iris, Christy, a coworker of hers, fell in slow motion, the cups on her tray shattering, but taking what felt like to Barry like minutes, maybe hours to do so. Then it was over, and the world had sped back up to normal. Iris looked behind her. You okay, Christy? Iris asked. She nodded. I'm fine, Iris. It's good to see you, Barry, Christy said as she loaded broken china onto her tray. Barry smiled a bit shakily. My dad is going to be so happy to see you. Let me go grab my purse. My boss will understand, Iris said before rushing off behind the counter. Barry's smile grew a bit more genuine as she nodded. Iris stopped to talk to her boss as she grabbed her purse. Her boss, who peeked over the counter. Barry waved, and Lily grinned wide and waved back. She patted Iris on the shoulder and nodded, grabbing something with a pair of tongs and sticking it in one of the small pastry bags. She handed it to Iris, who hugged her and raced out with her purse and the bag. She handed the pastry bag to Barry, who grinned and looked into it. It was one of her favorites, an old-style chocolate donut. She grinned as Iris linked elbows with her. On the house. Lily's happy you're okay, Iris said and leaned her head on her sister's shoulder. Barry smiled and bit into the donut. I have a request before we go to the precinct. I need a shower and my own clothes, Barry insisted. Iris nodded and opened the door to her car for Barry. I think we can do that, Iris said and turned the car down a different street. Barry was surprised when they pulled up to her apartment complex. She glanced at Iris, who smiled at her. You can thank the guys at the precinct. They made sure you wouldn't lose the apartment, she explained. Barry teared up a little bit as they walked up the stairs. Then she opened the door and actually did start to cry. There were flowers on nearly every flat surface. Mail was stacked neatly on her small kitchen table, surrounded by get well soon cards and flowers. She couldn't help but smile as Iris hugged her. I'm okay. It's just a bit overwhelming, Barry said, scrubbing at her face. Iris nodded and patted her on the back. Barry hugged her sister for a moment longer before she scrubbed her face and smiled. Right, I'm gonna run take a shower real quick and get dressed, Barry said, managing to pull herself together. Iris nodded and smiled. I'll wait for you out here, Iris promised. It only took Barry 5 minutes to shower and change, though it felt like longer to her. Iris grinned and they left, heading to the Central City precinct.